The young brown bear stood at the edge of the village where gravel met fog and forest, unnaturally still in the slate-grey dawn. People watched from porches and darkened windows as the animal lowered its head and placed something small on the ground directly in front of Thomas Begay, then stepped back 3 careful paces without turning away. Thomas's legs threatened to give out. His heart dropped into his stomach as he stared at the object catching first light, a bright orange fishing lure, the cheap plastic kind sold in every tackle shop from Juneau to Sitka. The kind his grandson had used. The bear's eyes stayed fixed on him, dark and steady, waiting for something Thomas couldn't name. Behind him he heard radios crackling to life. A mother pulled her daughter back through a doorway. Someone whispered a prayer in Tlingit that Thomas hadn't heard since childhood. The entire town of 47 souls had learned to wake early these past weeks, ever since the bear started coming. But this morning was different. This morning the animal had crossed an invisible line that separated curious wildlife from something no one's training could explain. I arrived in that village 3 months after this moment, following a rumor that wound through Forest Service offices like smoke, something about a problem bear that wouldn't behave like a problem bear, and an old Tlingit ranger who refused to let wildlife officers relocate it. When I finally sat across from Thomas in his small cabin that smelled of wood smoke and coffee, he showed me the lure first. He kept it in a wooden box with his grandson's name carved into the lid. "Tell me about the boy," I said. Thomas's hands, weathered and scarred from 70 years of Alaska living, trembled slightly as he set the box aside. "Jacob was 15, smart kid, better fisherman than I ever was." He paused, looking past me toward the window where rain streaked the glass. 2 years ago he took my skiff out alone. Storm rolled in faster than the forecast predicted. We found the boat overturned near the rocks, never found him. The search had lasted 3 weeks. Coast Guard, volunteer boats, helicopters, when weather allowed. They dragged likely currents and checked every beach and inlet within 20 miles. Thomas himself had walked shorelines until his feet bled through his boots, calling his grandson's name until his voice gave out entirely. The village stopped talking about it after a month, Thomas said quietly. "People mean well, but grief makes them uncomfortable. They moved on. I tried to." His jaw tightened. "I stopped believing in much of anything except tide tables and weather reports. Facts you can measure." He'd been a park ranger for 42 years before retiring, most of that time in Glacier Bay and the surrounding wilderness. He knew bears the way some men know engines or crop rotations, their feeding patterns, territorial behaviors, the subtle body language that meant bluff charge versus real threat. He'd taught dozens of seasonal rangers how to read wildlife, how to keep safe distance, how to respect the boundary between human and animal worlds. So when people started seeing a young brown at the tree line last spring, they called me, he said, wanted me to tell them it was normal, wanted me to make them feel safe. The first sightings came in April, just after breakup, when bears emerge hungry from dens. A sub-adult male, maybe 4 years old, perhaps 400 pounds, light-colored ruff around its neck. It appeared at dawn near the village edge, not raiding trash bins or fish-drying racks, not threatening livestock, just watching. I told them it was a dispersing juvenile looking for new territory, Thomas said. Told them to secure food sources and it would move on. He looked down at his hands. I believed that, had no reason not to. But the bear returned. Morning after morning, always to the same spot where forest met the dirt road that served as the village's main street. It would sit for 10 or 15 minutes, observing the houses with what Thomas described as unsettling focus, then melt back into the spruce and alder without hurry or fear. "Third week I found something on my porch," Thomas said. He opened the wooden box again and lifted out a small plastic bobber, the kind that clips onto fishing line. Faded red and white. Still damp. Smelled like river mud and salmon. His grandson had used bobbers exactly like this one. Thomas kept a whole bag of them in the tackle box Jacob had inherited. But these were common, sold in every marine supply store, used by every kid learning to fish Alaska's endless streams. I told myself it was nothing, Thomas said. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. Told myself the bear probably raided someone's gear, and the wind blew it onto my step. But something in his chest had tightened when his fingers closed around that wet plastic. Something that felt like his grandson's hand slipping into his own on their last morning together. He'd hidden the bobber in his pocket rather than mention it to anyone, afraid of what speaking it aloud might mean. That night, Thomas dreamed of Jacob standing waist-deep in a glacial stream, waving to someone just beyond the tree line. When he woke, his face was wet, and he couldn't tell if it was sweat or tears. The day Jacob disappeared, the sky had been deceptively clear at dawn. Thomas remembered standing on the dock, watching his grandson load gear into the 12-foot aluminum skiff with the easy confidence of a boy who'd grown up on the water. They'd planned to go together, but Thomas had promised to help a neighbor repair a generator. Just a few hours, he'd said. Jacob could fish the near inlet and be back by lunch. "I'll bring you a king," Jacob had called, grinning as he pulled the starter cord. Thomas had waved and turned away. Those were the last words his grandson ever spoke to him. By noon, the wind had shifted. By 2:00, the marine radio crackled warnings about a pressure system moving faster than predicted. By 4:00, when Jacob hadn't returned, Thomas was already in his own boat, fighting 3-foot swells and horizontal rain, shouting into the wind. They found the skiff at dusk, overturned and wedged between rocks near the outer point. No body. No life jacket, though Thomas knew Jacob always wore one. The Coast Guard said the currents were wrong. If the boy had gone into the water there, he should have washed up somewhere within days. Search dogs found no scent trail on any beach. It was as if the ocean had simply opened and swallowed him whole. Thomas stopped talking about it after the first month, stopped hoping after the second. By the time a year had passed, he'd learned to live inside the absence the way you learn to live with chronic pain. It never leaves, but you build your life around it anyway. He still walked the forest trails out of habit, decades of ranger work etched too deep to abandon. He checked game cameras, noted bear scat and moose browse, filed mental reports no one would ever read. The work kept his hands busy. It didn't keep his mind quiet. 6 months after Jacob disappeared, Thomas started noticing tracks. A young bear moving along the shoreline in an unusual pattern, not the typical feeding route following salmon runs or berry patches, but a more deliberate path that traced the search perimeter volunteers had walked a year earlier. The tracks appeared and reappeared near the old dock, near the point where the skiff had been found, near places Thomas himself visited when the grief became too heavy to carry indoors. Coincidence? He muttered to himself, crouching beside a clear print in the mud. Juvenile, exploring its range. But the tracks kept appearing, and they seemed to follow him. The first time he saw the bear itself, Thomas was standing at the overlook above the inlet, the place he'd stood 100 times, scanning the water for any sign of his grandson. Movement in his peripheral vision made him turn. 50 yards away, partially obscured by alder, a young brown bear stood watching him, not foraging, not moving, just observing. Thomas froze, following protocol. Make yourself large, speak calmly, back away slowly. But the bear didn't react with typical wariness. It held his gaze for what felt like a full minute, its dark eyes steady and unblinking. Then, without hurry or alarm, it turned and disappeared into the thick brush. his heart hammered. Not from fear. He'd faced dozens of bears closer and more aggressive than this, from something else, something that made the hair on his arms stand up and his breath catch. The bear had looked at him the way a person looks at another person, with recognition. He told himself he was projecting, that grief was warping his perception. Bears don't recognize individual humans by sight. They might remember a scent, associate a shape with food or danger, but they don't know you. Not the way this animal had seemed to know him. Over the following weeks, Thomas glimpsed it 3 more times, always at a distance, always still, watching him with that same unsettling focus before melting back into the forest. He began to recognize its features, the lighter ruff of fur around its neck and shoulders, a slight irregularity in its gait as if one hip had been injured and healed. A subadult male, he estimated, maybe 3 or 4 years old. Young enough to still be clumsy. Old enough to be dangerous if provoked. But it never showed aggression, never false charged or huffed or clacked its teeth. It simply appeared, observed, and vanished, leaving Thomas standing in the quiet forest with his pulse racing and his mind refusing to accept what his gut kept insisting, that this animal was seeking him out deliberately. The last time he saw it before it came to the village, Thomas had been checking a trail camera near a remote creek. He reviewed the footage on his laptop that night and found something that stopped his breath. The bear had approached the camera 3 days earlier, rising on its hind legs to peer directly into the lens. For 12 seconds it had stood there, close enough that Thomas could count the whiskers on its muzzle, its eyes dark and depthless. Then it had turned and walked directly toward the village. Toward Thomas. The bear appeared at the village edge on a Tuesday morning in early May, precisely at dawn when mist still clung to the spruce tops and the world existed in shades of grey. Old Mary Cadleck saw it first from her kitchen window and called Thomas on the radio before she'd even finished her coffee. "That young brown you've been tracking," she said, her voice tight. "It's here, just sitting at the tree line by the road." Thomas arrived within 5 minutes. A small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance, fishermen heading to the docks, early risers drawn by Mary's call. Everyone stayed back. Everyone watched. The bear sat at the exact point where forest yielded to human settlement, its posture neither aggressive nor fearful. Patient. When it saw Thomas approach, it stood slowly, turned its head to maintain eye contact, then walked 3 steps forward and stopped. The bear's behavior violated every pattern Thomas knew. Food-conditioned bears approached boldly, searching for easy meals. Territorial bears bluff-charged. Sick bears avoided humans entirely. This animal did none of those things. It simply stood in the morning mist, watching Thomas with an intensity that made his skin prickle. Then it lay down, front paws extended, head up, alert but non-threatening, the posture wolves use to show submission. Bears don't do this with humans. Thomas felt goosebumps cascade down his spine as he radioed the wildlife office in Juneau. The response came within an hour. Standard procedure. Use noise deterrents, rubber bullets if necessary. If behavior persisted, schedule for relocation. But that night, Thomas found the second object. He returned home after dark, exhausted from watching the bear finally retreat into the forest at dusk. His porch light revealed something that hadn't been there that morning, a scrap of fabric, bright yellow, water-stained and torn. It lay precisely centered on his welcome mat. Thomas's hands shook as he picked it up. Heavy-duty waterproof nylon. The specific shade of safety yellow from the rain jacket he'd bought Jacob for his 14th birthday. This couldn't be coincidence. Thomas looked toward the dark tree line. His scientific mind offered explanations. The bear had found debris from the accident, carried it randomly, dropped it randomly. But his scientific mind couldn't explain why it had been placed on his porch, undamaged by teeth or claws. He sat on his porch step until midnight, the fabric clutched in his hands, and for the first time in 2 years, he let himself cry. Because some part of him understood that his grandson was trying to speak to him through the only messenger that could make the journey. The bear returned the next morning, and the morning after that, always to the same spot. The village grew nervous, children were kept indoors. At the weekly community meeting, voices rose in concern. "It's habituated," someone said. "Needs to be relocated before someone gets hurt." Thomas sat silent, the yellow fabric hidden in his jacket pocket. "Give me a week," he finally said. "Let me try hazing protocols." What he didn't tell them was that he had no intention of hazing the bear. On the 4th morning, the bear brought a bent spoon. On the 5th, a frayed piece of rope. On the 6th morning, it brought something that made Thomas's knees nearly buckle, a zipper pull, still attached to fabric, bearing the logo of the outdoor company that had manufactured Jacob's backpack. Thomas stood in the dawn mist, tears streaming down his face as the bear watched from 30 feet away. He saw the lighter ruff of fur around its neck clearly now, saw the way the animal held its left side, slightly guarded, and in a flash of impossible understanding, he knew this wasn't a random bear. This was a bear his grandson had met, had helped, had touched, and it remembered. The village council meeting convened on the 7th day, and Thomas knew he was running out of time. The conference room in the community centre smelled of coffee and damp wool, and 12 faces turned toward him with expressions ranging from concern to outright fear. "We've got kids here," John Meikles said, his voice tight. "My daughter won't go outside to catch the school boat. This has gone on long enough." Thomas nodded slowly. He understood their fear. A 400-pound predator showing up every morning violated the unspoken contract between humans and wilderness. You stay in your territory. We stay in ours. Fish and Game can have a team here by Friday, Mary Cadleck added. Tranquilize it, relocate it, 50 miles. Inland, problem solved. 50 miles inland. The phrase lodged in Thomas's chest like a stone. He thought of the yellow fabric in his pocket, the zipper pull, the bent spoon. Objects carried deliberately, objects that couldn't be explained by any wildlife biology textbook he'd ever read. "Give me 3 more days," Thomas heard himself say. "If the bear shows any aggression, any at all, we call them immediately. But right now it's just watching. Not threatening, not raiding, just watching." "Watching you," someone muttered from the back row. Thomas couldn't deny it. The bear's focus was unmistakable. Every morning it appeared at the same spot, and every morning its eyes tracked Thomas and Thomas alone. 3 days, he repeated. "Then I'll make the call myself." The council voted 3 days, not an hour more. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table with the collection of objects spread before him like evidence at a crime scene. The fishing lure, the bobber, the yellow fabric, the rope, the spoon, the zipper pull, each one water-stained, each one small enough to carry in a bear's mouth without damage. His ranger training insisted this was impossible. Bears don't collect human objects. They don't remember individual humans across years. They don't deliver items like messages. But his grandfather's voice, decades-old memory from childhood, whispered different words. The Tlingit elders spoke of animals as people in different skins. They spoke of debts and honor that crossed the boundary between species. They spoke of moments when the world revealed itself to be stranger and more connected than modern minds wanted to believe. Thomas's hands trembled as he touched each object. Somewhere in the forest beyond his window, a young bear was carrying knowledge that should be impossible, carrying gratitude that shouldn't exist, carrying proof that his grandson had survived long enough to meet someone, to help someone, to save someone. The next morning, Thomas waited at the usual spot before dawn, and when the bear appeared through the mist, he did something he'd never done before. He spoke to it. "Show me," he said quietly, his voice barely carrying across the 30 feet between them. "If you're trying to tell me something, show me where." The bear's ears swiveled forward. It stood motionless for a long moment, and Thomas felt the weight of that dark gaze like a physical pressure against his chest. Then the animal did something that made his breath stop entirely. It turned, took 4 measured steps toward the forest, stopped, looked back over its shoulder directly at Thomas, waited. Every instinct Thomas possessed screamed at him not to follow a wild bear into dense forest. Every regulation he'd ever taught warned against this exact scenario, but his feet were already moving, his heart hammering against his ribs because he understood with absolute certainty that this was an invitation. The bear watched him approach, to within 20 feet, closer than he'd ever been. He could see the individual guard hairs in its coat, the old scar tissue around its neck where the lighter fur grew. Up close, the animal looked young, almost adolescent despite its size, maybe 4 years old at most. 4 years ago, Jacob had been 11. Old enough to go fishing alone in calm weather. Old enough to help an animal in distress. The bear turned and walked deeper into the forest, following a game trail Thomas had never noticed before. Every 50 yards it stopped, looked back, and waited for Thomas to catch up. The pattern was unmistakable, deliberate. Thomas followed, his radio silent in his pocket, his tranquilizer kit left behind in his truck. He followed because somewhere ahead lay answers to questions he'd been asking the empty forest for 2 years. He followed because a bear was leading him, and impossible as it seemed, he trusted it. They walked for 3 hours inland, climbing steadily away from the coast into terrain Thomas knew only from aerial maps. The bear moved with purposeful efficiency, choosing routes that avoided the worst thickets and unstable slopes, pausing at creek crossings to let Thomas find secure footing. This wasn't random wandering. This was a journey the animal had made before. Thomas's radio crackled twice with calls from the village. He didn't answer. How could he explain he was following a wild animal deeper into wilderness based on nothing but objects and intuition? The forest changed as they climbed. Coastal spruce gave way to mountain hemlock, then sparse subalpine meadows dotted with late snow. Thomas's knees protested, his lungs burned. He was 70 years old and hadn't attempted a hike like this in 5 years, but every time he slowed, the bear stopped and waited, its patience absolute. Around midday, they reached a high ridge, and the bear paused. Thomas caught up, breathing hard, and looked down into a narrow valley he didn't recognize. A glacial stream cut through dark stone, remote, roadless, the kind of place search helicopters might have flown over without seeing anything below the canopy. Thomas's heart began to hammer for reasons that had nothing to do with exertion. They descended as afternoon light slanted golden through the trees. The bear followed the water upstream, moving more slowly now, its body language shifting to something Thomas could only describe as reverent. At a bend where the stream widened, the bear stopped completely. It looked at Thomas, then looked deliberately toward a dark opening in the rock face, a cave, shallow but sheltered, its entrance partially hidden by mountain alder. Thomas's legs felt boneless, but his feet carried him forward anyway, his flashlight shaking in his hand as he clicked it on. The beam caught something blue, then orange, then the distinctive shape of a backpack propped against the cave's rear wall. Thomas made a sound, half sob, half gasp, and his knees hit the stone. floor. Jacob's backpack, water-stained but intact, a metal water bottle, a rain jacket bundled carefully, a small stuff sack containing emergency supplies, and a journal wrapped in a plastic bag preserved against 2 years of mountain weather. Thomas's hands shook so violently he could barely open the plastic. The journal's pages were damp at the edges but readable, Jacob's familiar handwriting marching across lined paper. He flipped to the last entries, and the words blurred through his tears. Day 3, after the boat flipped, made it inland following a creek. Found this cave, good shelter. Day 4, heard something crying this morning. Found a bear cub tangled in fishing line by the stream. The little guy was really stuck, line around his neck and one front leg cutting into the skin. Took me an hour to cut him free with my knife. His neck was bleeding pretty bad. Day 5, the cub came back. Brought me a fish. Later, he slept pressed against me. Kept us both warmer. His neck looks better. Day 6, getting weaker. Haven't eaten enough. Cub keeps bringing fish, but I can't. The entry ended mid-sentence. Thomas sat in the cave's dim light, the journal pressed to his chest, and understood everything. Jacob had survived the accident, had made it inland, had saved a bear cub's life, and then, weakened and injured, had died here, while the animal he'd rescued tried desperately to keep him alive. Outside the cave, the bear, no longer a cub, but not quite full-grown, sat watching the entrance, waiting. Just as it had waited for 2 years, guarding these belongings, carrying the memory of a boy's kindness. Thomas looked into those dark eyes and saw something he'd spent 40 years of ranger work insisting didn't exist: recognition, memory, and deliberate purpose. The bear had walked 50 miles to find the man who smelled like the boy. To bring him here, to show him what happened, to finally complete the impossible task of bringing Jacob home. Thomas sat outside the cave as the afternoon lengthened into evening, unable to move, unable to think beyond the weight of the journal in his hands. The bear remained nearby, lying in its sphinx-like posture at the edge of the clearing, watching him with what could only be described as patient vigilance. The sun dropped behind the western ridge, and cold began seeping up from the stone. Thomas knew he should start back. The hike down would take hours in darkness, and he'd told no one where he'd gone. But leaving felt like abandoning Jacob all over again, even though his grandson had been gone for 2 years, even though there was nothing here but belongings and memory. He read the journal again, and again, searching for hope in those final unfinished words, finding only the brutal truth that Jacob had survived days longer than anyone knew, had died slowly from exposure and injury while trying so hard to live, while saving a life that wasn't his own. Thomas looked at the bear, really looked at it for the first time without fear or professional assessment clouding his vision. The lighter ruff of fur around its neck, scar tissue he realized now, where fishing line had cut deep into a cub's throat. The guarded way it held its left side, probably residual pain from the leg that had been tangled. Physical evidence of the day his grandson had knelt in cold water and spent an hour freeing a terrified animal. "He saved you," Thomas said aloud, his voice cracking. "And you tried to save him." The bear's ears swiveled forward at the sound of his voice, but it didn't move, didn't flee, just maintained that steady, unblinking gaze that had haunted Thomas for weeks. Something shifted in Thomas's chest, not quite acceptance, not yet, but the first crack in the wall he'd built around his grief. Jacob hadn't drowned instantly in cold water, afraid and alone. He'd made it to shore, he'd survived. He'd done what Thomas had raised him to do, seen suffering and acted to stop it, even when his own situation was desperate. He'd died with a bear cub curled against him for warmth, both of them trying to protect each other, there were worse ways to leave the world. As full darkness settled over the valley, Thomas finally stood. His body protested, stiff from hours on cold stone. He carefully packed Jacob's journal and the most personal items into his own pack. Things the family would need for burial rites, the backpack itself, the water bottle, the other gear he left arranged respectfully in the cave, unable to disturb what had become a kind of shrine. When he emerged, the bear stood immediately. Thomas half expected it to leave now that its task was complete, now that it had delivered him to this place and shown him the truth. Instead, the animal moved to the trail they'd ascended and looked back, waiting. "You coming back with me?" Thomas asked, then felt foolish for speaking to a wild animal as if it could answer. But the bear's intention was unmistakable. It began walking down the trail at a careful pace, stopping every few minutes to let Thomas catch up in the darkness, leading him home just as it had led him here. Recording this story months later, I asked Thomas if he'd been afraid during that nighttime hike. Alone in the wilderness with a brown bear, exhausted and emotionally shattered. He'd looked at me for a long moment before answering. "I've never felt safer in my life," he said quietly. "I was walking with someone who loved my grandson, who mourned him, who spent 2 years trying to bring him home." If your heart is racing right now, if you understand what Thomas felt, subscribe to the channel. These stories need to be witnessed. They reached the village just before midnight. Porch lights blazed. The entire town had been searching for Thomas, radios crackling with worry. The bear stopped at the tree line, that familiar boundary between wild and human worlds, and for the last time it met Thomas's eyes. Thomas stood in the road, between the searching lights and the dark forest, between the explanations he'd have to give and the truth no one would quite believe, and he did something his ranger training had never prepared him for. He bowed, a deep, formal bow of respect and gratitude. The bear watched him rise. Then, without sound or hurry, it turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving only tracks in the dirt, and a 70-year-old man standing in the road with tears streaming down his weathered face. The village gathered 3 days later on the rocky beach where Jacob's overturned skiff had been found. Thomas had spent those days in careful preparation, consulting with the tribal elders about proper ceremony, explaining as much as he could about what the bear had shown him while leaving out the parts that sounded too impossible even to his own ears. He didn't tell them about following a wild animal for 3 hours into roadless wilderness. He said he'd been searching old trails and found the cave by chance. He didn't tell them about the bear waiting patiently while he read his grandson's journal. He said he'd pieced together what happened from the entries alone. Some truths were too strange to share, some debts too sacred to explain. The morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of crystalline Alaska day when mountains stood sharp against blue sky and the water reflected light like hammered silver. 40 people gathered in a semicircle facing the inlet. Family, friends, neighbors, the children from Jacob's school who were young men and women now. Thomas stood at the center, holding a cedar box containing soil from the cave, water from the glacial stream, and the journal wrapped carefully in traditional cloth. According to Tlingit practice, when a body cannot be recovered, these elements stand in its place, earth, water, and the person's own words, creating a presence that can be honored and released. The elders sang. Thomas's daughter, Jacob's mother, who'd flown in from Anchorage with red eyes and her father's same stubborn jaw, spoke words that broke and reformed and broke again. People shared memories of a boy who'd been curious and kind, who'd helped neighbors with their boats, who'd once spent an entire afternoon untangling a raven from kite string, who'd always stopped to help things that were suffering. Thomas was aware, peripherally, of movement on the ridge above the beach. Others saw it too, heads turning, voices dropping to whispers. A bear had appeared on the high ground, perhaps a quarter-mile distant, but clearly visible against the sky. The same young brown bear, the same lighter ruff of fur catching morning sun. "Should we—" someone started, but Thomas raised his hand. "Let it be," he said quietly. "It has a right to witness this." The elders exchanged glances, but didn't object. They'd seen stranger things in their long lives, and they recognized sacred moments when they appeared, even in unexpected forms. The bear didn't approach. It simply settled into a sitting position on the ridge, sphinx-like and still, its gaze fixed on the small gathering below. For the next hour it remained there, motionless as stone, while Thomas and his family performed the rituals of letting go. When Thomas finally knelt and poured the glacial water into the inlet, mixing mountain stream with salt tide, the bear stood. It lifted its head slightly, and from across the distance came a sound, not a roar or a growl, but a deep, resonant huff that carried on the wind like a sigh, like grief, recognized and witnessed. Then it turned and walked away along the ridge, its form growing smaller until it disappeared into the tree line, and Thomas knew, with absolute certainty, that this was the last time. The debt had been honored. The boy had been brought home. The bear's impossible task was complete. Thomas's knees threatened to give out, not from age, but from the weight of understanding flooding through him. His entire body felt hollow and weightless at once, as if the world had tilted on an axis he'd never known existed. Everything he'd learned in 42 years of wildlife management, every textbook, every training manual, every scientific paper about bear cognition and behavior, couldn't explain what he'd just witnessed. A dangerous predator had bowed its head at his grandson's memorial service. A wild animal had mourned. His daughter stood beside him, following his gaze to the empty ridge. "Dad," she whispered, "did that bear really—" "Yes," Thomas said, his voice raw. It did." She didn't ask him to explain further. Some experiences exist beyond explanation, in the territory where wonder and grief and gratitude blur into something language can't quite capture. That evening, as people gathered in the community center for the reception, Thomas slipped away to the forest edge where the bear had first appeared weeks ago. He stood in the gathering dusk, looking into the shadows between the trees, and spoke to the silence. "Thank you," he said simply, "for remembering him, for honoring him, for bringing him home." The forest gave no answer. But Thomas felt in some deep and wordless place that his message had been received. That somewhere in those dark trees a young bear with scarred fur and memories that shouldn't exist understood that the debt between them was settled, that both of them could finally rest. 2 weeks after the memorial service, a wildlife biologist from the University of Alaska arrived in the village asking questions. Dr. Sarah Chen had heard rumors through the ranger network, something about unusual bear behavior, object carrying, apparent navigation over long distances. She wanted to document the case for the scientific literature. Thomas met her at the community center with the collection of objects spread on a folding table. The lure, the bobber, the yellow fabric, the zipper pull. Dr. Chen photographed each item, measured them, took notes in careful scientific handwriting. "And you're certain it was the same individual bear throughout?" she asked. "Certain," Thomas said. "Same size, same coloring, same scar pattern around the neck." Dr. Chen looked up sharply. "Scar pattern?" Thomas explained about the fishing line, about Jacob's journal entries describing the rescue. The biologist's expression shifted from professional skepticism to something closer to wonder. "Mr. Begay," she said slowly, "brown bears have demonstrated remarkable spatial memory in recent studies. They can remember feeding sites and navigate back to them across years and dozens of miles. But this," she gestured at the objects, "this suggests not just spatial memory, but episodic memory, the ability to recall specific events and associate them with individuals." "Is that impossible?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. "It shouldn't be possible," Dr. Chen said carefully. "The research shows they're intelligent problem solvers. They use tools, they plan ahead. But remembering a specific human interaction from when it was a cub, then tracking down a related human years later based on scent association." She shook her head. That level of cognitive complexity, that kind of what we might call gratitude-motivated behavior. We've seen hints of it in primates, in elephants, never documented in bears. Thomas thought of the bear sitting on the ridge during Jacob's memorial, of the way it had led him carefully through dangerous terrain, waiting whenever he fell behind, of the objects arranged with care in the cave, protected from weather and scavengers for 2 full years. "What if," he said quietly, "we've been underestimating them? What if they're capable of more than the studies have shown?" Dr. Chen was silent for a long moment, studying the yellow fabric with scientific precision, giving way to something more human. "Then we need to reconsider everything we think we know about animal cognition and memory," she said finally. "Because what you're describing, what this bear did, it suggests a level of emotional intelligence and purposeful action that rewrites our understanding of the species." She wanted to search for the bear, to observe it, to gather data. Thomas refused. Some things weren't meant to be studied, he told her. Some debts were private matters between the ones who owed and the ones who'd paid. Dr. Chen left frustrated but respectful. Her report would later circulate among wildlife biologists as an unexplained case study, filed under anomalous bear behavior without satisfactory conclusion. Thomas didn't care about the scientific record. He cared that he understood, finally, what had happened to his grandson in those last days. That Jacob had died doing what his grandfather had taught him, showing mercy to creatures in pain. That the cub he'd saved had honored that mercy in the only way a bear could, by keeping watch, by remembering, by refusing to let the boy's kindness disappear into the wilderness without witness. A month after Dr. Chen's visit, Thomas was walking his usual trail when he found fresh claw marks on a spruce tree at the forest edge, the traditional way bears mark territory and communicate. But these marks were different. They were at exactly Thomas's eye level, placed where he couldn't miss them. Below the claw marks pressed into soft earth was a single clear paw print. A message. A farewell. A final acknowledgement from one who mourned to another. Thomas pressed his palm into the earth beside the print, human hand next to bear paw, and felt the impossible distance between their worlds collapse into something smaller. Something that felt like understanding. He never saw the bear again. Wildlife reports from the region noted a young male brown establishing territory roughly 50 miles inland near a glacial valley rich in salmon and berries. It avoided humans, displayed normal wariness, showed no unusual behavior. It had gone home, its task complete, its debt honored. But Thomas carried the memory of those dark eyes, that patient waiting, that inexplicable journey of kindness repaid. He carried it the way the bear had carried Jacob's belongings, carefully, reverently, refusing to let go. On quiet evenings, Thomas would stand at the forest edge and speak to the trees, telling his grandson's story to the wind. How Jacob had saved a life, how that life had remembered, how a wild animal had proven that the boundary between human and animal consciousness was far thinner than anyone believed, how love and gratitude could cross that boundary in both directions. His mind still refused to fully accept what he'd witnessed, even as he lived every day shaped by it. A 70-year-old man who'd spent 4 decades studying bears, who thought he understood their limitations, their capabilities, their nature, humbled by a young animal that had taught him the most important lesson of his career, that we don't know, that we can't know, that the wilderness holds intelligence and emotion and purpose we're only beginning to recognize, that sometimes, impossibly, animals are wiser and kinder than we ever imagined. I sat across from Thomas Begay in his small cabin 6 months after the memorial service, listening to him tell this story with a voice that still shook when he reached certain parts. The wooden box with Jacob's name carved into the lid sat between us on the table. The yellow fabric, the zipper pull, the journal now sealed in archival plastic by his daughter. Evidence of the impossible. Outside, rain drummed against the windows and fog erased the line between forest and sky. Thomas poured coffee with hands that had steadied with time, but still trembled slightly when he touched the objects. "Do you believe me?" he asked quietly. I'd spent 20 years writing about wildlife, interviewing rangers and biologists, documenting the intersection of human and animal worlds. I'd heard hundreds of stories. Most had rational explanations. Some didn't. "I believe something happened that we don't have language for yet," I said, carefully. Thomas nodded, as if this was the answer he'd expected. "My daughter thinks I was in shock. That grief made me see patterns that weren't there." He touched the journal. "But Jacob's words are real. The cave is real. The scar on that bear's neck matched exactly what Jacob described cutting the fishing line from." "What do the elders say?" I asked. For the first time, Thomas smiled, small and sad, but genuine. "They say the old stories are full of moments like this. Animals remembering kindness, debts that cross between worlds. They say I'm lucky the bear chose to honor Jacob this way by bringing him home instead of keeping him in the forest forever." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the fog-shrouded tree line where the bear had first appeared all those months ago. "I spent 42 years as a ranger," he said, "taught people that bears are dangerous, unpredictable, driven by hunger and instinct, taught them to keep distance, maintain boundaries, never attribute human emotions to wild animals." He paused. "I was wrong. Not about the danger, they are dangerous. Not about the boundaries, those matter, but about the emotions, about what they're capable of feeling and remembering." I thought of the bear sitting on the ridge during the memorial service, of the careful arrangement of objects in the cave, of the 3-hour guided journey through wilderness, the patient waiting at every turn. "You think it loved Jacob?" I asked. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "I think it remembered him. Remembered the pain of being trapped and the relief of being freed. Remembered a human child who knelt in cold water for an hour to save its life." His voice cracked. "I think it spent 2 years trying to save him back, bringing fish to a boy who was already gone. And when it couldn't save him, it did the next best thing. It found someone who could bring him home." If you've also witnessed wonder in the animal world, if your heart feels too full right now to contain, write "Animals Remember Kindness" in the comments. Share your own encounters with intelligence and gratitude that science hasn't yet learned to measure. These moments need to be witnessed and honored. Thomas turned from the window, and I saw tears on his weathered face. Some nights I wake up and think I imagined all of it. that it was just a problem bear and coincidence and my mind connecting dots that weren't really there. He touched the box with Jacob's name. Then I remember the way it looked at me, the way it waited, the way it led me exactly where I needed to go. "What will you do with the story?" I asked. "Tell it," Thomas said simply. "Not to convince anyone, not to prove anything, just to honor what happened. To say that my grandson saved a life and that life remembered. That somewhere in Alaska, a young brown bear carries the memory of a kind boy, and that matters, even if no one believes it, even if it defies everything we think we know." He walked me to the door as evening settled over the village. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the dark wall of forest at the edge of the clearing. "Do you think you'll see it again?" I asked. Thomas shook his head. "It's done what it came to do. It's home now, living the life Jacob helped save." He smiled, bittersweet. "That's enough. That's more than I ever thought I'd have." I drove away from that village carrying a story I still don't fully understand. My recordings of Thomas's voice shake at certain points, the same places his voice shook in person. The photographs I took of the objects feel insufficient. They capture fabric and plastic and paper, but not the weight of what they represent. Not the impossible journey of a bear that walked 50 miles to repay a debt. Not the love of a grandfather who followed that bear into wilderness on nothing but faith. Not the truth that sometimes, in rare and sacred moments, the boundary between human and animal dissolves completely, and we're left standing in the presence of something science hasn't learned to measure. Intelligence, yes. Memory, yes. But also gratitude, honor, and grief. Emotions we've claimed as uniquely human, while the wilderness has been feeling them all along. Thomas Bigay lives quietly now in his village, tending his small routines, walking his familiar trails. But he carries knowledge that changed him, that animals see us, remember us, and sometimes, impossibly, love us back. That we share this world with minds far more complex and hearts far more generous than we've ever given them credit for. That kindness, once given, echoes across years and species and the vast distance between what we think is possible and what actually is. And that's a truth worth remembering.